Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com and today I'm here with Elizabeth Hyde Stevens. Hi Liz!
Hi!
Liz is an award-winning fiction author and she teaches fiction at the Gotham Writers Workshop. She also created the Muppets, Mickey and Money research course at Boston University, and today we're talking about her book Make Art, Make Money, which is absolutely fantastic and I think should be required reading for every author who's taking this seriously as a business. So first up, Liz, tell us just a little bit more about you and your writing background.
Thanks, that was wonderful. I about 8 years ago wanted to write a novel and thought, okay, well, this novel will be the great American novel, and I think many people have that thought. So I started working on that, went to an MFA program. I went to Brooklyn College and studied under Michael Cunningham. He wrote The Hours, and he's a best-selling writer, and I kind of graduated thinking that I was going to immediately become that. And then once I graduated, I kind of saw that the world was a little bit starker for writers, and it's harder out there. You publish articles or short stories, and that doesn't necessarily make a lot of money. And I kind of realized, how does this writing plus money thing fit together? It's kind of the same thing that you look at. And it's not easy, but there are people out there who do it. And that's what led me to Jim Henson, actually, is thinking, well, he was this kind of, artist who was always doing it for the work itself and for the art's sake. But he was very successful financially. So studying him kind of helped me get a little bit further along in doing that myself.
Yeah, and that's what I think is great about your example, because I love Michael Cunningham as well. He's a great writer, and it's interesting to be able to combine both of these things. So obviously, you just mentioned Jim Henson there, and I like that you call him a capitalist and a staunch artist. Can you just talk briefly? I mean, hopefully everyone's heard of Jim Henson and the Muppets, but just a brief overview of his journey, because he wasn't born a multi-millionaire. So how did his journey work?
Yeah, I don't know if I can do this in a nutshell, but Jim Henson started out as a high school teenager. He was doing set design and kind of graphic design for the local the theater company in his high school. He auditioned to be on local TV, and this was 1954, so he only had a television for 4 years. It was kind of the new medium, and you could kind of go on local TV a lot easier then than you could now. But he wasn't a puppeteer. He was more an artist. Puppeteering was what eventually led him to get to have the reach, the global reach that he wanted. But he was interested in whatever medium he could use. So from that local kids shows that he was doing as a teenager and college student, it led to his own 5-minute show, Sam and Friends. That ran for I think 6 years. Then in the 60s, he was doing experimental stuff. He wanted to make a nightclub. He was doing documentaries, whatever, like weird, wacky skits on the Ed Sullivan Show. During this time, he was also making commercials. So that was kind of a weird side business where the commercial work from corporations funded these experimental things he wanted to do. During this time, he lived in New York. He had an agent. He was making pretty good money, but then he decided to do this new project, Sesame Street, in 1969, and that was for a nonprofit, and you wouldn't think you would make any money doing that, but ironically, that's what led him to be a millionaire, because first of all, that was broadcast to every home in the United States. So it made him a household name. Then he was also able to merchandise toy products, records, learning machines, and stuff like that. And so the revenue from that is what then fueled the rest of his career. 1975, he got the Muppet Show made, finally, after 15 years of trying to get his own show. It came out on Lord Grade's London ITC network, but it was broadcast in 100 countries all over the world. So, that was just another level of success. After that, he made Hollywood movies, the Muppet Movie in 1979, and more movies to follow, The Dark Crystal, which was his misunderstood masterpiece. And then in the 80s, he was a mogul by that point because he had kind of built up this name for himself. And he was producing other shows like Muppet Babies or Fraggle Rock, The Storyteller, lots of different ideas that he could at that point make into reality much more easily. And then right before he died, he was in talks with Disney to start making theme park rides and 3D movies, which was kind of the next frontier and something that he needed their money, the big bucks to do. So it looked like the 80s or the 90s would have been an even more exciting time in Jim Henson's life. But his life was cut short by a strep infection that was particularly aggressive. And so, you can watch on YouTube the Jim Henson funerals, and you see Big Bird there singing "It's Not Easy Being Green," and you see like all of the puppeteers coming together that he basically brought together. And it's a really special moment where you kind of look at the legacy of this one man.
I think it. I mean, partly your book has so much in, but one of the things is this kind of retrospective look at a man who, like you said, started as a teenager and took him 15 years to get his own show. And I love the fact that we can look at his life. Like I look at Beatrix Potter as another example of, a creative person who took a long time to get to the point of actually making money, but was able to, as long as you focus, I feel like as long as you keep stepping in a direction, after 15 years you can be that overnight success or whatever. But it's interesting, you talked about saying in the book, Jim Henson made peace with money. He found a way to make art and money dance, which is a lovely phrasing. So I wondered, how do you think Jim sort of found that mindset of peace and making money dance?
That's a really good question. I think that he was lucky because it seemed like he kind of fell into something profitable at a very early age. So, he's in college and he's making these skits on Sam and Friends that are just kind of wacky lip sync stuff, very much like college student stuff. But then he has to have a sponsor. And so as part of his 5-minute show, some of that time has to be spent talking about SK luncheon meats. And so, he had to have Kermit, he didn't have to. He could have just basically ceded some of his airtime. And I think that the decision, or maybe it wasn't a decision, but for him to actually have Kermit have a banjo and sing about bacon and, housewives cooking like chicken drumsticks and stuff like that, it almost makes sense from an artist's point of view because he has control over his entire show and he gets to make it what he wants. He doesn't have to interrupt the show. He could make the sponsor promo part of the entertainment. So that was his first taste of commercials, and that he said at the time he liked having money in his jeans. And he graduated with he drove to his graduation in a rented Rolls Royce. And I think that kind of mindset, he had a taste of what money can do for you. And the thing it does is it allows you to do what you want, and it's not, he was always kind of money hungry, but not in the way that we think of. He was kind of hungry for that funding from Lord Lugrade, $250,000 per episode in the 1970s to make the Muppet Show what it was. And people said that the Muppet Show was never copied or watered down like so many things are because it was so expensive to make. So, he was always kind of looking for that next, he needed Lord Lugrade to make a movie to fund The Dark Crystal, or he needed Disney to fund a theme park ride. So he was money hungry kind of in the right way.
And when you talk about those things, I think in the book, we know about Jim Henson, but like you say, there were hundreds or even thousands of people that he had to work with. He was a leader of a kind of a tribe and a team. And to me, many of these big projects need collaboration, so you need money to do them. Like I can write a novel on my own and self-publish it just paying an editor and a designer, but I can't make a TV show or a movie on my own with my own money. So you have to have money if you want to do these big projects, right?
Yeah, I think so. And it shows up. It's he wasn't kind of spending money on needless things. He was spending it on artists. So it's basically he was giving other artists a job, spending money on the time that they needed to make these things. And like the Dark Crystal, I think it took 5 years, and it probably didn't need to. And they didn't need to invent a language that didn't actually end up showing up in the film, or invent a whole species and understand how they evolved. But that when I watched that as a kid, my mind was blown. It was like seeing a cathedral and thinking, oh, people can do this. It's really a gift to humanity. I think various art projects have varying levels of funding that you need. So maybe we don't all need that kind of millions of dollars, but I think we could all do more, and kind of do bigger, more exciting things. And so if you think of money as the way to get there, I think that's a good way to look at money.
Yeah, and I think you have this sort of circle, don't you, of, you need the money to allow you the time to make the art, and then if the art makes some money, that means you have more time to make more art, and it just kind of goes like that. And what I love about this new indie kind of movement, like I'm working with translators, 50-50 royalty split, together we're making more than we could make on our own. And, the way things work now, many creatives can work together, and like Kickstarter and all this, it's amazing stuff going on because of being able to find money in different ways. So, I think that's brilliant. So, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned licensing briefly. Can you talk about some of the ways that Jim's, he didn't just have a puppet, he turned things into multiple streams of income. So can you just talk about the different ways that the income happens?
Yeah, it really starts with copyright, and Brian Henson said that his dad's real genius lay in always understanding he needed to own his copyright. So, what started out as Kermit on Salmon Friends in the 1950s later grew into many more things. So, in 1969, when Sesame Street started, Kermit got big. At that point, you didn't have any home video. So when you watch TV, it was kind of this fleeting, poetic thing. You experience it, and then you don't get it back. Then, early on, the first merchandising that Jim Henson did was the Sesame Street Alphabet album. So it was a record album, and, you can picture Jim Henson and Frank Oz in the studio just, singing these silly songs. They did it at night. Jim Henson loved to work all night, work all day, work all the next night. So, it started out as this, just a simple record album. Then CTW kind of convinced Henson that in order for them to continue their independence, they needed to merchandise more products, and they called them learning machines. But they were toys. And so, you might have a Bert and Ernie puppet, but you might also have other merchandise. And when the Muppet Show then it added new characters, then you had way more products. And so I have a Miss Piggy soap dish and little ceramic objects, but plenty of things. Like Michael Frith did a calendar of Miss Piggy that took off and became huge, and she became this kind of international pinup model. So they're doing creative things, and a lot of these were in-house, but it's still merchandising, and merchandising is when somebody else makes the product, and you just get money because it's your character. So that's it's an amazing windfall that Jim Henson had. And then on top of that, home video came out in the 80s, and so then you could sell those, you could sell cassette tapes, any number of things. And there was also a Muppet store briefly where a lot of merchandise was sold. But it all kind of goes back to the fact that Jim Henson owned those copyrights. And in the early days of making commercials, his agent would say, hey, can we do this commercial? It's going to be $50 grand or $60 grand. And he said no, because they want to own the characters. So I don't think that Jim Henson anticipated, 20 years down the line, he'd make millions off of these copyrights. But I think that for him, it was about an artist's power, and you don't want somebody else to control your character. You want to be the one protecting it and investing in it and helping it grow and kind of leading it.
Yeah, and I mean, can you talk about that from an author's perspective? How can authors make sure they're protected? Because I know there are clauses in some people's contracts that basically claim ownership of the entire world that an author might write in. So, what are your thoughts around this from a fiction author's perspective?
Um, I feel like, the contract that you get is always a starting point, and I think it's really good for authors to remember, well, if they're at the table and they've handed you a contract, they want to work with you. So, read everything carefully. I've had a lawyer friend look over my contracts, but I've spotted stuff that he didn't spot, and the kind of things that he was interested in. It said, "Oh, that doesn't matter to me." So I think, really taking ownership of this for you and understanding that, you're going to make mistakes because you're going to miss something, but the next time you won't be so lax about that. There's this great story, to go back to Jim Henson, where his agent Bernie Brillstein, when he was getting the contract for the Muppet Show, he had worked initially with Grade's U.S. manager, who said, we really like you and we want to give you this show, but there are some things, Lou Grade's not going to be happy about this. So it seemed like, from Brillstein's perspective, well, Lou Grade was the bad cop, and he was kind of playing this act. The good cop was the U.S. manager. And I suspect that what the thing was that he was not happy about was keeping Kermit separate from the merchandising rights. While Jim Henson owned the copyright, he split merchandising revenue with Lou Grade for all of the Muppet characters, Fozzie, Piggy, Scooter, but not Kermit. Mm. And Kermit was also off the table for Sesame Street because he came from much earlier, from Sam and Friends. So, that may be what Lou Grade was not happy about in this negotiation. But Brillstein said that Lou Grade called him personally, and he said, "I'm not happy, with this, and I'm sorry, but I can't give you this thing that you want." Hmm. And Brillstein said that that's the moment when he knew that he could get that thing, because the president of the company doesn't call you if they don't really, really want to work with you. So it was really an encouraging story for me, because I thought, well, if they really want you, you can stand up and demand this thing. And that's what Brillstein was saying. And the Muppet Show did get made, and they got everything that they needed to make it. So, it worked out.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, because the last show I had David Morrell, who wrote First Blood, which became Rambo, and one of the things he talked about was the importance of retaining ownership of the character, and of course he never knew where Rambo would end up, in the same way that nobody would have known where Kermit would have ended up. And I think as authors who, many people listening are going, yeah, but I'll never be David Morrell, or I'll never be Jim Henson. But, who knows? We just don't know. And I mean, like you say, it takes time. And I don't know about you, I've been writing fiction nearly 4 years, not 15 years. And I can't even imagine what's going to happen in 10 years' time. So I think when we're doing things, we have to just try and imagine what could possibly happen and protect ourselves.
Definitely. And I think part of it is the time. I mean, it's the 10,000 hours theory, which, I subscribe to that Henson was building Kermit from 1954 to, 15 years before Sesame Street. And so, who knows, perhaps any character that you put that much time into, and Henson never slept, so it was double 40 hours of the week that he was putting into this character. I wonder if that's actually what makes it a profitable or lovable creation, is just how much you have given to it.
And that, which is really interesting, because most people, I mean, even I'm thinking at the moment, right, I've got 5 books in this series, maybe I should have a go at another series. But you're right, is there an amount of time, a tipping point? Have you looked at anyone else and seen any kind of, a sort of patterns, I guess? Not to a great degree. Actually, the next project that I want to work on that I haven't gotten that far in is looking at Nintendo and the Legend of Zelda series, because that's something that I think it started in 1985, the first Zelda,
And as technology grew, it became 3D, and then it became a Nintendo Wii and motion control. And it's grown into almost, a masterpiece of the level of the Dark Crystal. Mm. So, that to me is something where, it's continual reinvestment in the character has, I think, led to success. But that doesn't mean it has to be that way.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really interesting. But let's talk about that workaholism. You have the quote, "Art is work," and the work was his cake and streamers, which I loved. I was reading that going, yes, because I mean, everyone accuses me of being a workaholic. I work every hour I can until I basically collapse with a migraine, and I love it because I love what I do. And I wondered if you can, talk a bit about his work ethic, and I guess the element of fun, and what is the definition of work, I guess.
Yeah, I think that we have the wrong idea about work. I mean, especially, the people around me, it's like you want to work as little as possible, then go on the weekend and have fun. And if possible, you want to invest your money so that your money makes money and you never have to work. But, I think that Jim Henson loved his work, and he said he wasn't a workaholic because he sincerely loved what he did. It gave him great joy, and he chose it. So, I think he's still a workaholic. I disagree with him there. That's the one thing I disagree with him on. But he, on his birthday, he would spend his birthday working on a project, an unpaid project, just something, sketching or watercolor or writing a story. And that's something that I do also because it's a gift to myself. And I think Jerry Jewell, who was a longtime writer for the Muppets. Henson did the visuals mostly and the performing, but the writing actually came from this man, Jerry Jewell, who was with them the whole span of time. But he said about Jim Henson that the one memory he has that sticks out above all others is Jim, something funny has happened in the studio with the performing, and Jim is on the floor laughing, and he's laughing so hard that he's crying, and that everybody around him is just in tears, just like really enjoying this moment because it radiated out from Jim Henson and how much he really loved his work and enjoyed it. And I think that these are people who work so hard, and they've got their hands up in the air, and if you try to do that for even 1 minute, it gets really tiring and exhausting. But this kind of work environment is something that I've always wished I had, because you watch these behind the scenes shows and you just think, well, these people really loved what they did, and it was goofy and wacky and had so much freedom, and yet the satisfaction of hard work was there. And I think that Henson once said that the satisfaction of doing a good job is better than the feeling of eating a great meal or having all this money in your pocket. It's something that really feeds the soul.
Yeah, and I always think that we're so lucky as authors that really we can write until the day we die. I know P.D. James talks about how scared she is that she'll die in the middle of a manuscript, and she doesn't want anything that's left unfinished when she dies, but she keeps not dying. She's like 96, and she's still alive, and she's like, should I start another book? Or and I love that, and I feel that with Jim as well. He was probably happier to go while still working,
Oh yeah, definitely. There were only 2 times he didn't want to work, is what his son said, and it was sort of these moments of why didn't, say, The Dark Crystal work? Why didn't people like it and go to the theaters and the critics like it? And so he kind of was reflecting during those few times, but every other time in his life, he wanted to work. He wanted to go into work. If he needed surgery, he got it on his lunch break and then worked until 8 p.m. And then probably, the next morning flew to a meeting somewhere else. And I think, it's not the middle-class life that we think that we want, but I think it might be more exciting and, more enriching.
Yeah, and I was like, yes, he's the man, that's how I live, so I'm really happy about that. But you talked about The Dark Crystal there, being a bit of a failure, or and like you, I remember it, and I actually think that That, I mean, I remember that very vividly, and I write very dark things. Maybe that's his fault. But I wondered, what about, how are his failures as important as the successes? And, talk a bit about the things that went wrong, because it wasn't just all cake and streamers, was it?
No, there were many failures. And the thing about successful people is they just kind of don't put that into their biography. So, we typically think it's very easy for somebody to be successful, like, famous writers, they always had it easy. But there was just so much failure. To get the Muppet Show made, for instance, Henson really pitched his heart out and made these great pitch films, and gave them to all the major U.S. networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, and they all passed on it. They said, puppets will not work at nighttime for adults. That's just not the American market. Puppets are for kids. We don't think that this will work. Henson, of course, was right, because once it got on TV, in the United States, it was syndicated right before prime time. And it became wildly successful. It was viewed by 200 million people. And Time magazine said it was the most watched show on Earth. So he was right. But it just took so much failure and so many pitches to come in and, get meetings with the network executives, try to convince them. And you can actually watch the pitch reel if you go on YouTube and search for a Muppet Show pitch reel. And it's amazing. It's Jim Henson saying, hey, the show is going to get a 40 share of the ratings. It's going to appeal to everybody. Everyone in the country is going to watch it. Kids, parents, hippies, intellectual eggheads. Do it for kittens and puppies and for apple pie. It's the best thing. And it didn't work. It was, this was a failure, but that didn't stop Jim Henson. And so he dusted that pitch tape off and, sent it out to Lou Grade. And it worked for him.
Yeah, and now I guess people are making YouTube videos and more and more and more of them, and eventually getting noticed. So, it takes time. It's so important. But another thing that was interesting is you say, talk about the pure art don't sell, find a handle. And that branding spin and the marketing spin, that's very difficult for authors, especially literary fiction authors, I'm sure you know. So do you have any tips for the sort of pitchman approach?
Yeah, that was a lesson that I needed to learn. And so all of the lessons in the book are basically to me as a younger person saying, this is what you need to learn. But that's great, because that's what I wanted to do with the project, to actually grow as a person. With pure art don't sell, that's based on this quote that Jim Henson had about Kermit, that Kermit was not initially a frog. He was just a thing, like an abstract sock puppet, basically. And that Henson liked that better because that was more kind of symbolic in what he was doing in those days, with kind of these abstract aliens, and it says something about humanity, and it was more cerebral. But he realized, that people need a handle, he said, and he used that word. So if you make Kermit a frog, or if you make Rolf a dog, that makes them instantly understandable. You could grab the handle and people understand it. So it's more accessible to the audience. And so that was something that I kind of realized for myself. Maybe, these long paragraphs that I was writing describing like a leaf on a tree, maybe that didn't need to be there, or maybe that needed a handle, a better handle, that it could be geared towards, how are people going to understand this? And I guess that essentially comes down to working against an audience. Workshops, I think, do that to some extent, but in a lot of fiction writing workshops, you're dealing with other writers, and so they're really excited about these long paragraphs too. And so I think, as much as I can now, I want to work with real readers and kind of try things out, because I think the way Jim Henson worked was like many artists, where it's just you experiment, it's trial and error, and that's really the best way to learn, because he said if you learn too much from what other people have done, you're going to do what everyone else does. So, to answer your question, how you asked, how can literary writers sort of, He
or
said,
any writers think about marketing.
Think about yes, that was it. Sorry, marketing. So, I have a great piece of advice for this, and it's another YouTube video. So this is Jim Henson had this weird side business. After commercials, he stopped doing commercials when Sesame Street started because that seemed wrong to have, say, Cookie Monster selling cookies or something like that. Understandably, but he kept making these little pitch films. It started out as something that he would do to bring into a meeting with one of these corporations and say, hey, I'm going to make you a movie. And it was kind of a funny little skit version of his pitch. So he eventually, in the 70s, was making all these corporate sales films. So basically a business could rent this and show it to their salespeople. And it was entertaining, and it made fun of kind of how boring meetings are, and it's work stuff. It was workplace humor. So if you go to YouTube and you search for Muppets sell, there's this great video, and it's Henson. It's Jim Henson, and this is a man who called himself shy, and this is a man whose agent said, well, he rarely spoke above a whisper. He never got mad. He wasn't this boisterous, charismatic, aggressive person. He was, like most writers, shy, quiet, maybe a little bit bookish. But you can see him in this video actually like pitching his heart out. And he's saying, hey, get out there and sell, sell yourself. And it's very similar to what he was actually doing in his career with the Muppet Show pitch video. In fact, they're almost the same character, and it's almost the same script. But if you watch Jim Henson, like, he's worked himself up into this this state of mania almost, trying to get what he wants, or trying to say, hey, give me this show, like, I can do this, I'll show you what I can do. And it's really inspiring to me. So to me, watching somebody who I know is shy doing that, it makes me think, okay, I can try to market myself better.
Yeah, and then going a bit further on you, how are you thinking about your next book? As in, what have you learned with writing this book? Because this, of course, you've got fiction and non-fiction, which I also have fiction and non-fiction, and it's difficult to have both, and you market them in different ways. But what are you doing around marketing for your work?
Well, yeah, this is something that I realized. This is the test spin, and I've learned a lot. But I really think that I need to, in my next book deal, really make sure that I can partner with somebody. And I don't have enough people right now to help me to get my work out there. It's time consuming, and then it's also an area of expertise that a writer, well, I don't have. And it doesn't come easy to me to kind of send my work out to 1 million people. I can do that once a week, but when that's kind of something that's ongoing, it almost seems like, well, that should be somebody else's role who is really great at that and gets a kick out of that, rather than me, because as a writer, I love to communicate, but I also find myself being shy, and I have to kind of psych myself up to go do this. So it's like it's kind of the introvert's dilemma, probably, because it's I can kind of turn it on and be that extrovert, but that's not what gives me energy. Doing the work gives me energy.
Yeah. Although, I like this, podcasting you're doing. It's just you and me, right? There's no one else here. It's great. And then you never know who's going to see it or listen to it. And to me, it's interesting how this kind of intimate chat actually is good for marketing. And yeah, it's pretty fun. Well, I'm having fun.
Yeah, I'm having fun.
That's cool. Well, it's interesting, though. I actually think that these days audio and video can be more effective, even though we're marketing a written book, because there's so much noise and so many books out there. But and like with Jim, obviously it was the visual stuff. His work was visual, but it's just so interesting how that works.
Yeah, it's true. I think he had such an advantage. I think, when you're working in multimedia, movies, animation, it's just, it's on all levels. It's sound, it's audio, it's visual, and that was Jim Henson's strength. So that's what he was great at. As I said, like his writer Jerry Jewell, I sometimes think, well, maybe I'm more like him because he really he was the glue that kept all the characters together, and he really gave a lot of the nuanced interpersonal stuff to the characters. Of course, like that was also the performers themselves improvising and adding dimensions. But I think Jerry Jewell, he needed to find a Jim Henson, because as a writer, you just have your words to kind of call up pictures and create characters. And it's hard to compete with, as you said, the visual media. So I think as writers, it makes sense to utilize that in whatever ways you can. I've hired artists before to try to render characters I have, thinking, if you have something visual to show people, even before you have a book deal, that could be something that gets interest going.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Okay, so I want to tackle head on the people who may still be listening who want to talk about selling out. This kind of I read, was it in your book about when you say when you sell out? Selling out is a good thing. It means your seats are all full, and if there's sold out, on a shop door, it's great. It means it's so popular. But
no, it's not from mine, but that's a great statement.
Yeah, I read that somewhere else then. But what do you think about this selling out, and how can people deal with that negativity?
Yeah, I think it's hard because there's always boundaries you don't want to cross, and I think it's right to say no to things. That's how you kind of keep the characters who they are. That's something I read about with Jim Henson and with Walt Disney, is that they would tell people, no, like Mickey wouldn't do that, or Kermit wouldn't do this, and it would drive people crazy. But that's if you know something, you should stand up for that. But then differently, there are lines. And for Jim Henson, the big example for him was merchandising, and he thought that was selling out. He literally said, I don't want to sell out. His agent said, you should do this for a lot of reasons, but the main one is that you'll get creative freedom with all this merchandising money. And so Henson did what he literally thought was selling out. And because of that, we know the Muppets. And, I think of, maybe a brilliant painter who paints a masterpiece, but if it's in a coffee shop, in some little town, and nobody ever sees it, what kind of legacy does that person leave? What kind of legacy, what kind of gift do they give the world? Very few people get to receive it. So distribution is kind of on my mind, because that's something that I need for my book, and that's not for the profits, but for the, this is why I wrote it, to kind of hopefully, well, this is going to sound crazy, but I wanted to change the world, because I thought, well, if all the artists I knew suddenly became like entrepreneurial geniuses and could go out there and kind of achieve what they wanted, what a different world that would be. Because I think, we often think, okay, well, the hedge fund managers, those are the people who are going to run the world. And that's just how it's got to be. But I think, what if you had educators and artists running the world, creative people who kind of, thought about life in the round. So in my mind, distribution is that kind of thing that's the holy grail. And that's really selling out. It's kind of reaching more people, reaching like all the people, which I think was Henson's goal also, is to kind of have everyone in the world sit in front of their TV at the same time and like watch this one thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think, if we all just think, I certainly grew up with Fraggle Rock and, with the Muppets, and I think we all can feel that helped us all in some way, and I think that's brilliant. So that's fantastic. And I was going to ask you about because we're coming to the end of our chat now. We've talked about your non-fiction. Just tell us a bit more about your fiction, so people know.
Great. Well, one story that I did a few years ago was called Wolf Memoirs, and it's a story about a scientist But that was in a very little publication that had like a small distribution list. So I'm an object lesson in this, where I spent years working on this like gem of a story, and then how many people saw it? I don't know, 500. So it's on my website if you want to take a look at that, if that's your bag. My novel, The Great American Novel of the Future, is the story of a 100-year-old man, and he becomes enlightened. That's the spoiler. But basically, he's on a journey of self-exploration at age 100 that involves a life extension drug and a trip to the Amazon.
Oh, and is that out?
No, that's not out yet, but that's I'm coming back to that.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, well...
Jim Henson is sort of my role model, and he never gave up, so that's something that I'm still going to make sure comes out someday.
Oh, fantastic. So tell us where people can find all your work and you online.
Yeah, well, on Facebook you can find the Make Art, Make Money community. I'm on Twitter as Liz Hyde Stevens. And then my book is out on Amazon, and you can get that as a Kindle or as an audiobook or a paperback.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Liz. That was brilliant.
Thank you. That was fun.